Augustine was formulating and bringing teachings that had never to that point been a part of the church. Back before Augustine introduced some of these concepts, the church universally defended and held to the idea that every person was born responsible, able to respond to the proffered grace of the gospel. It was only after a former Manichaean Gnostic, who was very well known because he was kind of the apologist of the day, he was the great mind of the day, he was a very influential leader who converted from Manichaeanism, debated the Manichaeans, debated all of the false people, and so he became kind of the voice of the church, and he was doing a really good job actually defending the traditional views of free will and everything else for, a couple decades even before he began to shift in his focus in his debate with Pelagius and really began to, most scholars agree, bring in more Gnostic kinds of thoughts about how God works.
Can we jump in there? Because that's an interesting point. One of the things, if you go back to my early preaching, I started our church 23 years ago, almost 24, only church I've ever pastored. When I was on my own, I started, my degree is from University of South Florida. I never went to a Bible seminary, but I started studying and I got really enamored with Calvinism for a time. If you go back early in my messages, you're going to go, oh, that's Calvinism. I mean, I was this close to just full out. One of the things that stuck out to me was it was as if church history, and I know this is a broad statement, but it was as if church history really began with Augustine. Everything else before that was sort of confusion. But when you read online, and I know that's, but when you read, it was as if it started there. And it wasn't until years later that I realized that he had some real dangerous, I won't even say heretical, I don't know that much, but some real dangerous things that were baked into there that we don't realize. But they'll use the term doctrines of grace as if that links it like it's always been that way. They'll go Calvin, Augustine, Paul. And can you talk a little bit about that, maybe that gap that you just mentioned between Paul and Augustine, and then should we be aware of that about Augustine that we don't know?
Yeah, there's a huge gap, almost 500 years. Think about that, 500 years where I'm sitting right now in Dallas, Texas. It would have been surrounded by Apache, Comanche Indians here. Yeah, I mean, there's think about doing Texas history and starting now instead of, you know what I mean? It's just, that doesn't make any sense to start with Augustine when it comes to church history. Did all of the early church fathers get everything right? No, of course not. But when we're talking about a soteriological worldview, anthropology, the nature of man, and you start with Augustine and you virtually ignore the teachings of the church by and large up to that point, you're doing an injustice to Christian theology and the development of it, in my estimation. Now, just because Augustine was the first to articulate these views doesn't necessarily mean he was wrong. Sam Storms and some of these other Calvinists, they argue, well, God, used Augustine to right the church and to bring them back to the right thing. So and he's being an honest Calvinist because at least he's acknowledging the first 400 years didn't teach. And I've got several quotes in my book, Drawn by the Father, and other books as well, where I cite these things. So this is not all just me talking off the top of my head. There are citations of this from Calvinists like Berkhoff and Bettner and so many others that I cite in my book, even modern day Calvinists from the Covenant Reformed Seminary, who say that Augustine did depart from, took a significant departure from the early writings of the church, I think is their exact quote. And so they're acknowledging this, and the significance of the departure is huge because it has to do with what we as provisionists, traditional Southern Baptists, have major contention with the Augustinian grid. And that is, we don't believe God decreed for all of us to be born in a condition where we can't respond positively to his proffered grace through the gospel. We believe he actually, though, yes, we're fallen, yes, we're corrupt, yes, we have inclinations towards sin and all the other things that we can talk about with the fall, but we're still able, we're still response able, we're able to respond to the gospel being sent to his enemies. You'll hear Calvinists say, well, we're enemies of God. And I say, well, of course we are, but what's the gospel for, if not for an enemy of God? And they'll say, well, you don't understand, Leighton. We're enslaved to sin. Oh, so of course we are. The gospel's sent to people who are enslaved to sin so as to set them free. Truth will set you free. If you ignore the truth, you suppress the truth in unrighteousness, it won't set you free. If you accept the truth, it will set you free. Of course we're enslaved to sin. Why do you think I disagree with that? And that's one of my passionate points, because they think being in enmity with God and being slaves to sin equals morally incapable from birth to responding to even the incarnation and the gospel, the Holy Spirit wrought truth of God sent to earth, calling us to reconciliation. And to me, that just, one, doesn't make any logical, rational sense that God would decree for his own creation to be born in a condition that they can't respond to his own call and his appeal of the gospel to be reconciled, and then send them to an eternal hell for not responding positively, for something they have absolutely no control over.
I think you hit something. It seems to me not even not just a moral inability, but they are by definition almost including it in the transcendent anthropological inability. In other words, they were created on that way. And you just hit something on page 6 of The Potter's Promise. To me, you said the direct quote from Calvin: by predestination, we mean the eternal decree of God, by which he determined with himself whatever he wished. And then it goes on, literally stating that he created, all are not created on equal terms, but some are predestined to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. That is a profound statement, because it's not just a moral inability. It is an absolute essential inability of them. And that's an odd thing. Now, you mentioned a moment ago about the Gnosticism of Augustine. Because he's to me, it seems that's where everybody goes back. What was it specifically about him that began to tweak things this way, and why? I guess that's the question I'm getting at. Why was it embraced and moved forward like that?
I'd recommend. I'd recommend a book by Ken Wilson, Dr. Ken Wilson, Oxford graduate. He's also one of those brainiacs that knows several languages, and he's an orthopedic hand surgeon as his job, and he still has time to go get a degree from Oxford. So he's yes, he's a very, very, very articulate and intelligent man. I've had him on the broadcast, Soteriology 101, 3 or 4 times, and so you can look up his name and see some of our interactions. And he has a book. He wrote his dissertation, which is like this thick. I've got a copy of it over there. But he wrote a layman level term to that, a smaller book, the Foundations of Augustinian Calvinism, something like that. I think it's the name of it. If you looked up Ken Wilson Foundations on Google, you'd find it. On Amazon, you'd find it. But it walks you through all those details and gives dates and all the things that it does. And I always encourage people, check the citations, check his work. Some people have found little discrepancies here and there about something he's quoted or something he's said. But from my own experience, when I check those out, they're superfluous to the major point that Ken is making. You can always find little, well, he should have quoted this, or he should have quoted in this language, or this was the year, he missed the year by 2, or whatever it is. I don't know. They'll find some things to just nitpick him about, but not address the major issue that he's talking about. And that is the thing that even Calvinistic scholars have already admitted, that Augustine was formulating and bringing teachings that had never to that point been a part of the church. He was popularizing. Now, there was some of his own contemporaries that are agreeing with him and that are also saying similar things. So a lot of people will bring out quotes from Jerome or somebody else in that contemporary time and say, oh, look, see, it wasn't Augustine. This guy wrote before Augustine. What's that? Well, Augustine is known as the one who popularized these doctrines. Just like Calvin wasn't the only Calvinist of his day, he was the namesake for that worldview because he's the one who popularized it. And so and a lot of people try to nitpick this point to death and then thus ignore the point. And that is, at this time, this is the very first time you really begin to see this anthropology change, where all of a sudden men are born in this condition where they cannot positively respond to the proffered grace of the gospel. They can't respond to a preacher who preaches the gospel clearly in your hearing. Why? Because the nature you were born in is so corrupt, so enslaved, so at enmity with God, you will never want to. You will always want to say no. That concept was not introduced into the church until the time of Augustine. And I stand by the research on that. I think it's very, very obvious. I think the fact that I can find Calvinistic scholars who concede that point proves that I've probably done a better job, because I've yet to see any non-Calvinistic scholar concede the other point. I've yet to see any substantial evidence teaching otherwise. And so that's the major point of contention, because that's the bedrock on which the rest of this soteriology grows. It starts with inability. Even R.C. Sproul, the well-known Calvinist R.C. Sproul, says that the entire tulip stands or falls on the T of tulip. And this is the anthropology, that total depravity is not just about depravity, by the way. If it was just about depravity, we would all agree. But it's about inability, moral inability, radical corruption, this concept that you can't respond.